Welcome to Proclaiming Justice, a podcast from PJTN that focuses the light of truth on vital issues in today's headlines that impact every American. I'm your host, Laurie Cardoza-Moore, founder and president of Proclaiming Justice to the Nations, and I'm here to educate, motivate, and activate you to action. I want to arm you with the truth and the facts you'll need to fight and preserve our constitutional republic and uphold the Judeo-Christian values our nation was founded upon. Welcome to Proclaiming Justice, a PJTN podcast where we shine the light of biblical truth on vital issues from today's headlines that impact every American, Jew and Christian, people of faith and people of conscience. I'm your host, Laurie Cardoza-Moore. If you missed the last episode of this podcast, you will find it and our previous podcast lineup on our website at pjtn.org, as well as all the other platforms that you use to access your favorite podcasts. On this week's podcast, I have invited Israeli Ambassador Yoram Ettinger to discuss the crisis in U.S. education. Ambassador Ettinger served as the Consul General to Israel to the Southwest in Houston, Texas. He is one of the foremost thought leaders on U.S. education and American history. Additionally, I have interviewed Ambassador Ettinger on several of our award-winning Focus on Israel programs. If you have not seen this program, you can view all of our past episodes at pjtn.org. I also want to remind you that it's important for you to listen and share this and all of our previous podcasts with your family and friends so that they can become more informed about this and other related issues that threaten our republic and the state of Israel. So please remember to like and share. Ambassador, welcome to PJTN's Proclaiming Justice podcast. It's great to have you back on our show again and to speak with you, sir.
Well, thank you. It's my privilege and my pleasure.
So I want our audience to know that Ambassador Ettinger is coming to us from Israel. So my favorite place to be, my favorite place to vacation in the world. So Ambassador Ettinger, it's so good to have you back on. So let's talk about the crisis in education, because you are one of the leaders who has taught and spoken many times about the unique relationship historically between America and Israel, between Jews and Christians. And as a writer on American history and the Hebraic influence on our nation and its founding, I'd like to talk to you, sir, about this important relationship and this important history and why it is so important to Christians and even members of the Jewish community. I have many times members of the Jewish community who don't know this history as well as Christians. So this is an important conversation for us to have, especially in light of what's happening to our nation. So let's start with Haim Solomon. Ambassador, tell us a little bit about the history of Haim Solomon and his influence on the American Revolution and his relationship with George Washington.
Well, Haim Solomon was an immigrant, a Jewish immigrant from Poland who came to the U.S. a few years before the 1776 revolution against the British monarchy. He was fascinated by George Washington's vision. At that time, he was one of the wealthiest persons in the colonies and probably in the world as a whole, dealing with global finance. And he funded much of the revolution. He was imprisoned by the British for those patriotic efforts and concocted pneumonia, which later on caused his premature death. And he was released from prison shortly before the eruption of the revolution on account of his commitment to desist from supporting the revolution, which he reneged on and continued supporting the revolution. Following the revolution, when George Washington and the whole system was on the verge of bankruptcy, and there were some voices suggesting to us, the British, to come back. It was Haim Solomon who took care of the salaries, the wages of the entire public or most of the public system. In fact, when he passed away 2 or 3 years after the revolution, again due to the pneumonia which he concocted in British prison, his wife Rachel from Philadelphia, who thought that she was wife of one of the wealthiest person in the world, in the colonies, found out that she remained penniless because he mortgaged literally their entire properties to the functioning of the revolution, to the functioning of the legislature and the executive following the revolution. And it took many, many years until the US publicly recognized his contribution. There is a very impressive statue in Chicago commemorating George Washington, the Treasury Secretary, and Chaim Solomon. And in 1975, the US awarded Chaim Solomon's memory with a special issue. But when it comes to the reality of US-Israel relations, it precedes much by many, many years the 1776 revolution. The roots of the special bond between the Jewish state and the United States goes back to the Mayflower of 1620. And when the Mayflower took off from Europe, according to documentation which were preserved by William Bradford, who was one of the two leaders of the Mayflower, according to those documents, they conducted discussions and they assumed that they left modern-day Egypt, England. They referred to the sail of 7-8 weeks to the colonies as the modern-day parting of the sea, and the destination, according to them, was the modern-day Canaan, the modern-day chosen, the modern-day Israel, the modern-day special country, and they viewed themselves as the modern-day chosen people. That's the reason that while I speak right now from Jerusalem, Israel, we have only one Jerusalem. In the US, there are 18 Jerusalem,
wow.
in addition to 30 Salems, like Salem, the capital of state of Oregon. But Salem is the biblical Shalem in Hebrew, which was the original name of Jerusalem. There are over 80 Shilohs in the US. There are well over 20, 30 Bethels in the US. And for those of the viewers who travel to Zion National Park, it's not only the name of the national park, Zion, which is a biblical name, obviously, but when you enter the park, as I did about a year ago, you see on the left-hand side, inside the park, 3 majestic cliffs. And according to the guides over there, their name is the Cliffs of the Patriarch. One is Abram,
Wow.
one is Isaac, one is Jacob. Now, I spend much time on Capitol Hill. I come to the US 3-5 times a year. Always try to spend about a week on the Hill briefing members of the House and the Senate, mostly their staffers. And when you enter the chamber of the House in the Capitol building, you see that in front of the speaker, facing the speaker, is the bust of the head of Moses. Now, he's not the only one. There are 23 busts of the key givers, key givers of human law in human history. And Moses is at the center, facing the speaker, the only one who looks straight. All the rest are in profile. And when
Mm.
I saw it the first time, which was back in 1989, when I assumed my role as ambassador in charge of Israel's congressional relations, I asked the curator of the Capitol building, why is Moses' bust different than all other busts? He looks straight and they are in profile. His response was, because Moses is the foundation of human law, the rest of the major lawgivers are byproducts of Moses. And therefore, Moses, the foundation, stares at the speaker, and the byproducts are in profile because they stare at Moses. You cross a small street which separates between the Capitol building and the Supreme Court, and you find out that there are 7 statues and engravings of Moses and the 10 Commandments in the different halls of the Supreme Court, including the main hall above the seats of the 9 Supreme Court justices. There are few statues. One of them is Moses holding the tablets. And by the way, it's not limited to Capitol building or the Supreme Court. Throughout the U.S., there are well over 200 monuments of the 10 Commandments, including one on the ground of the Texas State Capitol in Austin, Texas, State Capitol in Little Rock, Arkansas. There is one in Oklahoma City. It used to be on the state capitol. It was removed from the state capitol. There are different court proceedings in an attempt to bring it back to the ground of the state capitol. But the bottom line is that the roots of U.S.-Israel relations refer to a very distinct shared foundation of history and values, including the elements which shaped the U.S. civic system, the judiciary system.
Mm-hmm.
And when you assess that foundation, which again goes back to 1620, you realize it transcends the political beltway of Washington. It eclipses strategic and economic and military agreements between the two countries. It eclipses, it came well before, preceded well before the establishment of the U.S. and the establishment of Israel. It has to do with the foundation of the U.S. culture, which has been or was significantly influenced by biblical values.
Absolutely. That's fantastic. You know, I have said that our nation was founded on the Torah of Moses, and you just made my argument. What about the founding documents? You know, you talk about the monuments, you talk about the busts that are in the U.S. Congress and also in our Supreme Court building. What about the influence of the Torah or the Hebrew writings in the Bible and its influence on our founding documents?
Well, you take the Articles of Federation, you take the Constitution. It was those documents were authored by people who were well versed in the Bible. Some of them were in fact well versed in Hebrew. You take the issue of the Federalist system. Why did they choose such a strange name, Federalist? There was no such system anywhere in the world. That system is anchored in the concept of liberty, freedom, independence. Why didn't they call it the independent or liberty system? Well, the Federalist system, the name Federalist, has its roots in the Latin word fidus, and fidus refers to the divine covenant between God and Abraham, God and Jacob, God and Moses, to the covenant which united and guided the Jews during the 40 years in the desert from slavery in Egypt to deliverance in the land of Israel. You look at the system, the federalist system, the 13 colonies. As far as the founding fathers, the 13 colonies were a modern version of the 12 Jewish tribes. And the governors of the colonies were the modern day presidents of the tribe. The whole division of governance to three branches again has its roots obviously in great British and French philosophers such as John Locke and Thomas Hobbes and Montesquieu, but also relied heavily on biblical or mostly Mosaic legacy. Moses, or to be even more accurate, the teachings of Jethro to Moses, which gave rise to the division of government. Jethro taught Moses that he cannot take care of everything on his own, and Moses divided the government. He became the chief executive, Aaron became the chief judiciary or chief spiritual leader. The 70 elders were the initial legislature, and again, the 12 leaders of the tribes became the governors of that system. And one of the testimony to the influence of the Mosaic legacy or the legacy of the Exodus upon the founding fathers and the creation of the American culture and civic system goes back to the Liberty Bell. The Liberty Bell of 1752 has one verse engraved on it. And by the way, I see it every time I come to Capitol Hill, because the original one obviously is in Philadelphia, but there are hundreds of replicas throughout the US. One of them outside the Union Station, which is right next to Capitol Hill, and I usually take the metro to Union Station and then walk to Capitol Hill. And as I walk, I also walk past Liberty Bell, and I've seen it from 1989, literally hundreds of times. But each time I stop by the Liberty Bell just to make sure that this is not a dream and it's a reality. And I read the engraving, and the engraving is from the book of Leviticus, chapter 25, verse 10, which is the essence of the concept of Jubilee. And Jubilee, according to the Mosaic legacy, is the pillar of fire of what liberty is all about. Every 50 years, the Jews were instructed to release all slaves, to return land to the original owner, to return homes to the original owner. And the founding fathers took the Jubilee to be their own pillar of fire, pursuing liberty in the new state of the colonies as one unified United States.
That's amazing. And all of this history, ladies and gentlemen, this, unfortunately, what you just heard from Ambassador Ettinger is not being taught to our children in the classroom in America. It's just profound, and it's shocking that we have lost this part of history, in fact, we omit the Jewish impact or the Hebrew impact of our society, of our country, of our culture. And now we see a rise of anti-Semitism.
And in fact, Lori, one does not have to be a Jew, one does not have to be evangelical Christian to realize the significance of those roots. You take, for instance, 1968, the launch of the Apollo 8. Apollo 8 was the first spacecraft to orbit around the moon. There were 3 astronauts, none of them evangelical, and they were asked to make a statement to the people of the USA. I remember that because in '68 I did my undergraduate in El Paso, Texas, UT El Paso, and I still remember that historic broadcast and what the 3 astronauts did in their time allotted to them was they read the first 10 verses of the book of Genesis. And
Wow.
when they came down, the top people at NASA asked them, how come you chose those 10 verses? Because the expectations were, you're talking about so-called secular Christians. Maybe they would talk about the fantastic view from up there. They would talk about the achievements of NASA. And the response by the 3 astronauts was, when we were up there watching the world at the palm of our hand, we concluded there's nothing more fitting than the first 10 verses of Genesis, the creation of the world. And by the way, the same goes for military people as far as the impact of the Bible or Jewish history
Right.
in West Point, in the administration building. There is a small monument made up of 9 small statues of the 9 leading military leaders. It's called the 9 Worthies, the first top 9 military leaders. Of the 9, that you can also see Joshua and King David and Judah the Maccabee. And again, the reason is the legacy of those 3 personalities, their morality on the one hand, their leadership, and the capabilities of fighting, which top military authorities in the US assumed would be a proper inspiration for contemporary US military leaders. And then you go back to, I would say, the vast majority of presidential inauguration speeches. It's very rare to have a president going through his inauguration speech without quoting at least one or not 2 verses from the Jewish prophets in the Old Testament. You go back even to the reality on Capitol Hill. President George W. Bush assumed his presidency, and I remember that event. It was a typical, the traditional Senate luncheon in honor of the incoming president. And it was Mitch McConnell, who was already at that time the leader of the Republicans in the Senate, who welcomed the president by suggesting, we trust that you shall lead us in the best tradition of Joshua and Caleb. Now, Mitch McConnell, again, as you know, is not evangelical, but for him, those 2 personalities symbolize something that is worthy to share with the rest of the Senate. And by the way, you don't need to be a Republican to do that. You take Tom Harkin, who was the floor manager in the Senate of the Obamacare. And Tom Harkin was one of the longest serving Republican senators, certainly among the more liberal Democratic senators. But when the vote was concluded, and I believe Obamacare prevailed by about 5 votes, Tom Harkin, the secular liberal Democrat, convened the press conference. And the first sentence he uttered at that press conference was, I commend Harry Reid, who was at that time the Senate Democratic Majority Leader, for leading us in the best tradition of
Mm,
modesty, Samson's strength, and King Solomon's wisdom. And
mm.
again, this is a liberal
Wow.
Democrat who knows his ropes, the ropes of public statements. He didn't want anyone of the listeners or viewers to miss anything, but he knew most Americans would understand what does he mean by the patience of Job, or the strength or bravery, courage of Samson, and the wisdom of Solomon. And there are many such examples, which again transcend by far what today's media focuses on, namely politics, military affairs, economic affairs. And I
Mhm.
don't underestimate those affairs, but there is nothing as important as the foundation, and the foundation of the US, which enabled the US to catapult to the top of human achievements in human history. Those foundations
Mhm.
happen to be biblical foundations, and they also happen to be the foundation of US Israel relations. And while we have experienced many frictions between Israeli prime ministers and American presidents, the fact is that since 1948 until today, all of American presidents pressured Israel one way or another, besides one. President
Mhm.
Trump was the only president to
Mm.
refrain from pressuring Israel. But all the rest pressured Israel. But still, from 1948 until today, the expansion of commercial ties, of military ties,
Mhm.
scientific ties, agricultural ties exceeds the
Mm.
wildest imagination of the most supporter of US Israel relations. And in my mind, it has to do primarily because of the very wholesome foundation, which have proven themselves to be stronger than any short-lived frictions between the administrations of US and Israel.
Amen. And I want to just mention to our audience, Ambassador Ettinger brought up Joshua and Caleb. And you all remember Joshua and Caleb were two of the 12 spies that were sent into the land to investigate, to see by Moses, to investigate to see, is the land as good as they have been told that it is? And they went in. 10 of those 12 spies came back with a negative report. They were fearful. But Joshua and Caleb, who came from the tribe of Judah, Joshua from the tribe of Ephraim, united together and they said, we can take them. And so it is in that spirit that we have this whole history that we don't know. And I think the blessing, and Ambassador, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the blessing of America has come upon America because of the promise that is stated in Genesis 12:3, when God told Abram, I will bless those who bless you and curse him who curses you, and all the nations of the world shall bless themselves by you. And so look at America. Look at what past nations have done to the Jewish people, the persecution, with the Holocaust, with the Inquisition. We know what happened back in Persia and, of course, in Egypt. But, ladies and gentlemen, this is such an important part of our history. And it's why it is so important that we teach this to our children. But before we move to the closing of the program, Ambassador, you spoke to me before we got on this call about a new relationship that you have formed with another member of Congress from Louisiana. Tell us about him.
Well, I will refer to, but just one more comment about the legacy of Joshua and Caleb and the Mosaic legacy and the biblical legacy as a whole. Uh, it is as relevant today as it was then. And I'm a secular Jew. But I'm studying my legacy, and the more I study, as a secular Jew, the more I appreciate it as a most relevant prescription to today's challenges. And when you talk about Joshua and Caleb, you can refer to them as the fathers of the can do mentality. And
Mm,
there's nothing which describes America and Israel,
mm,
the US and Israel, better than can do mentality and defiance of odds. This is what has made America very special country in global history. This is what has made America the leader of the free world. The American exceptionalism is
mhm,
based on those values. And as an Israeli, I observe what's going on in the US, and I'm concerned about gradual distancing oneself from the legacy of the founding fathers, the legacy of the early pilgrims, which
mm,
again did provide the prescription for the catapulting or the surge of the U.S. to the top of global history, top of human history. When it
mm,
comes to a recent visit I had just a week and a half ago on Capitol Hill, among other people I met, was also Congressman Clay Higgins from Southwest Louisiana. And upon entering his office, he shared with me his deep sentiments toward the biblical roots uniting the Jewish state and the United States, and responding to my own assessment of those foundations, he took off a ring from his finger, showed it to me, and
mm,
the ring has the in Hebrew, the very important Jewish prayer, short prayer, "Hear, O Israel," what we
mm,
call in Hebrew Shema. This is a prayer that observant Jews recite few times every single day. They start the day with that prayer. And here is this congressman with his ring engraved on the ring,
mm.
that prayer. But again, it's just one other element of what one can see on Capitol Hill, in the U.S. Supreme Court. By the way, also in the Library of Congress, which is in the same complex. The major reading room, the Jefferson Room, has a huge statue of Moses holding the tablets. And once again, this is the prescription that catapulted the U.S. for the sake of the U.S., for the sake of the free world, and for the sake of every ally of the U.S. The U.S. should not distance itself from the legacy of the founding fathers. The
Mm,
U.S. should
mhm.
strengthen that legacy because, as they say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. No, this has been very enlightening, and I thank you so much for taking the time. My biggest concern is the mission of PJTN is to combat and fight anti Semitism. And in your closing statement, Ambassador, how important is American education to fighting this age old Jew hatred?
Well, it's not a question of Jew hatred. I think again, it's a question of the future of the U.S. Just like the future of Israel, it's based on strong identity. It's based on strong roots. It's based on appreciation of those roots. It's based on patriotism. And the weaker is our patriotism in Israel or in the U.S., the weaker is our attachment to our roots, the more feeble
Mm,
will be our future. And more than that, I think that the more we respect our roots, the more respect we derive from other entities.
Amen. Amen. And in closing, Ambassador, are there any final comments you want to make to our audience? And if you wouldn't mind just sharing with them, how can they follow you and learn more about the work that you are doing in Jerusalem?
Well, the only advice I can have is uh, the more we study our roots, the stronger we are facing contemporary challenges. It's like a tree. The deeper the roots, the stronger the trunk, the more fit is the tree to withstand the smothering storms, the threatening storms. Same applies to individuals, same applies to nations. As far as my own writing and assessments, you can find it on my website, www.theettingerreport.com, and there you can see a topic, U.S.-Israel relations, and one of the subtitles is the 400-year-old roots, and you'll find much information about the legacy of the early pilgrims, the legacy of the founding fathers, which, as I believe, is the prescription for strong presence and stronger future.
Amen. Amen. Real quick, how important do you think it is that we teach this to our children in our public school systems? Because we're not teaching what you just went through. The whole litany of history is not being taught. Save the state of Florida, we were able to make changes in their civics and Holocaust standards to incorporate some aspects of this history. But how important is this, Yoram, to the next generation of America, and also the state of Israel? Because if we don't teach these values and these truths to our children, are we going to have a continued relationship between our two nations?
No, you're absolutely correct, and there's no doubt the sooner we start teaching the next generation, the healthier we'll be in the future, and it applies to anything we do. You want your children to be well versed in good manners. You don't wait until they go to the university. You try to teach them good manners when they're babies. The same thing applies to learning foreign languages. The sooner you start, the better off we are. But here we're talking about, again, the roots and the trunk of our existence, and we could pay a very, very steep price for failing to share that legacy with our children. And once again, that legacy is not outdated. That legacy is very, very relevant to today. And in many respects, it's more important and more relevant today than it was 4,000 years ago, when the biblical legacy just became part of our history.
Amen. Amen. So well stated. Thank you so much, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed this program. We will post this podcast on our website and all of our podcast platforms so that you can share with your family and friends. This was so informative. As PJTN Watchmen, we have a biblical mandate to stand against the ungodly rising Marxist threat that is destroying this nation and other Western nations, threatening our Judeo-Christian values and promoting anti-Semitism. We cannot remain silent. God warned the prophet Ezekiel about the responsibility of the watchman. And the watchman's duty is to warn the inhabitants of the city when they see the enemy advancing. And as a watchman, you can sound the alarm and warn others by simply sharing this podcast with your family and friends. So please share and like this podcast to help sound the alarm in your community. Remember, Dietrich Bonhoeffer reminds us, silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. Don't forget to join us for next week's podcast as we continue this conversation about combating the rise of anti-Semitism and taking back local control of our communities and our children's education. I want to also remind you that if you have not signed up to become a PJTN Watchman, you can help support this mission through our award-winning documentaries and Focus on Israel programs, as well as more programs like this for just $20 a month. So go to our website at pjtn.org to watch our programs and listen to our past podcasts. With your generous monthly donation, you can ensure that PJTN remains on the front lines and in the headlines, but we can't do it without your faithful prayers and financial support. I hope that you will prayerfully consider supporting our mission as we educate to activate Jews, Christians, and all people of conscience to stand on the front lines of this all-encompassing war. God bless you, and thank you for all you do on behalf of our Jewish brethren, the State of Israel, and these United States. Thank you again for joining me on this edition of Proclaiming Justice. Please share this podcast with your family and friends. For more information about how you can get involved, please visit our website at pjtn.org. As a PJTN Watchman, you can help us keep up the fight to preserve our freedom for our children and their children for such a time as this.